Senator Carol Blood. Unfortunately, she's not going to be able to be with us today. She has come down with COVID. So we wish her a complete and a speedy recovery. And so I thought, gosh, that's going to kind of shorten things up a little bit. And I thought, we have somebody who was heavily involved in a lot of renewable energy policy. That's a former state senator. That I thought I would invite up to fill Carol's slots. So welcome, Al Davis. So we have a good mix of urban and rural, thanks to family obligations, travel obligations, and a host of other things, trying to come up with the perfect mix of veteran and newer folks in the process who represent both urban and rural areas. This is all a little more complicated than it appears. So we appreciate the folks that are able to make it here today. And I thought we would just kind of jump right into it. And so when you start, you can tell us a bit about what district you represent and all those things. I'll let you do that in your own words instead of me mischaracterizing your district. Wouldn't want to do that. But I thought the first round would be to sort of kind of start at the end with Senator Brandt. And so as we think about the renewable energy opportunities and challenges, I'd sort of like to hear your ideas on what you think the challenges are, what you think the opportunities are in our state for renewable energy development. Take it away, Senator Brandt.
Thank you, John, for having us here today. This is, I think, the third or fourth year that I've had the opportunity to do this, and I really appreciate the effort that's put into this. My name is Tom Brandt. I am the state senator from Legislative District 32, Fillmore, Thayer, Jefferson, Saline, and southwestern Lancaster counties. We were in severe and extreme drought this year. Is anybody here from Norris Public Power? And PPD. Thank you for keeping the lights on. I mean, I'm an all-electric irrigator down there, and I appreciate the fact, as severe as the drought was in our part of Nebraska, I think I had less timeouts this year than what I usually see. So this is what it's about. At the end of the day, it's keeping the lights on. Now, can it be hydro, coal, natural gas, solar, wind? Absolutely. Methane. I see Al Junkie sitting there from the pork producers. Methane is a component in this. I'm a farmer, and I've seen some of my counties get really torn up over wind power in the last 2 years. We get a lot of phone calls on this. There's a rumor that a company is coming into a community, and in about a week you'll see signs up, and the whole complexion of this thing has morphed in the last few years. It used to be that we as farmers or landowners would group together and we would invite companies and we'd do anything to get these wind projects going. And now we've got solar in the mix too. And all of a sudden now you have some very extreme views by the people out there. And honestly, it isn't really the farmers or the big landowners as much as acreage people or the people that live in the little towns. And they're very, rightfully so. I mean, they're very concerned about certain things. And I don't think the energy companies have done themselves much good, particularly when they come in and try and force things. That's when people really start to lose it. A lot of our small counties have local planning and zoning, and that's been a real disaster for those guys. If you can imagine, you're sitting on a planning and zoning in Jefferson County or Thayer County, and it's a county of 5,000 or 7,000 people, and you know most of them. At the end of the day, you aren't going to run over your own people. And that's kind of what we see down there in my part of the state. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity out there. There's a lot of opportunity for energy production, renewable energy production. We can use pieces of ground that are rough, that aren't good livestock ground, aren't good crop ground. We can use the roofs on our hog buildings to generate solar. We can use the manure to make methane to generate another form of renewable. there's a lot of opportunity out there, but you have to have everybody on board before you start. You can't just go in there and say this is going to generate, $700,000 in property tax. That's not going to be a big seller in a lot of the communities anymore, because the truth of the matter is most of your ag landowners are paying most of the property tax in those communities already, and the people that are opposed to it tend to live in town or on these acreages. So you have two different components there. So that's about all I've got, other than the fact that I'm sitting next to two attorneys, and my favorite joke in the whole world is, how many attorneys does it take to grease a combine? 2, but you got to run them through real slow.
That was much more harsh than my criticizing him for bad handwriting earlier in today. Senator Dungan.
Well, it's very nice to be here. Didn't know I was going to come into a roast. My name is George Dungan. I represent Legislative District 26, which, for those who are not familiar, is Northeast Lincoln. When John was saying there's a mix of vets and newbies on this panel, I will admit that I am the newbie. I am pretty new, brand new to the legislature. So I was elected right before this last session and just went through my first session. So I am absolutely still learning as I go. And I think it's important in these situations to understand that we're always learning. So I apologize in advance if I say anything that sounds ignorant. I'll be honest, this is an area that I was not well versed in prior to coming into the legislature. My background, as Tom very nicely alluded to, is as an attorney. I was a public defender actually in Lancaster County for about 9 years. So my background comes from law and trial practice. That being said, I've been involved in and kind of surrounded by environmental issues for quite some time, both because of friends of mine and various advocacy groups that I've been a part of. And so it's an issue that's really near and dear to my heart, and one that I think that we as a legislature have been continuing to try to address over a long period of time. But we run into a number of factors pushing back on some of the things that I think we could be working towards with regards to renewable energy. Personally, I can't speak for the Natural Resources Committee or other folks who might have a little bit more experience than myself, but my sort of foray into this area, this last legislative session, was with one particular bill that I brought that I just wanted to talk about briefly, because I think it's important to understand sort of how we bring these things and also why we bring them and how we can do them better. So I brought a bill this last session to prevent homeowners associations from saying you cannot have solar panels on your house. So this is something I didn't know existed. I didn't know that HOAs had covenants a lot of times that said, thou shalt not have solar panels on top of your house. Oftentimes they come along with other language and other restrictions with regards to modifications of the property. But there are a number out there that specifically delineate solar panels as something you're not allowed to have. We brought this legislation in my office after having heard of a number of actual issues that had cropped up with this. And so there were individuals I later found out in my district, but also around Nebraska, who had installed solar panels, having reviewed their HOA covenants, thinking it was fine, only to later be contacted by an attorney from the HOA saying, you have to take those off at your own cost or else X, Y, and Z is going to happen, right? Whatever violations and clauses they have in there with regard to that. And come to find out that taking solar panels off of your house is almost as expensive as putting them on. So I'd talked to folks who had spent thousands of dollars installing these, thinking it was fine, who ultimately had to remove them at their own cost. I think $8,000 was one estimate they'd been given just to remove the solar panels. So that struck me as an issue, primarily because when you have individuals who are seeking to be a part of the solution with regard to renewable energy, I don't think they should be punished for that. I think they should be encouraged. And one thing that I've learned kind of diving into this world, again, brand new to this, is it's not a silver bullet solution. I think one thing I know from talking to all of the experts in this field, and I think Senator Brandt alluded to this, is it's not just going to be one thing as the answer, right? When we're talking about solar or wind or whatever else you may be discussing, it's almost always going to be an aggregate of those things. But to me, that means that individuals who are seeking to be at least a part of that solution shouldn't be punished for doing so. So we brought this legislation this last session, and we're immediately, told that we were going to just ruin homeowners associations and all this other jazz. We also, I think, were maybe a little bit overbroad in the way that we wrote the legislation. It also included leases for apartment buildings, and landlords did not like that, understandably. And so there were a number of things in the legislation that we talked to folks about, and we decided we were going to change and modify. So I'm actually reintroducing the legislation this session because it's now modified enough. I don't think it's the same bill anymore. But at the end of the day, it gets to the crux of the issue that prevents these HOAs from saying you can't do that. Taking even a further step back, I think part of the reason that's important to me is my district is urban, as John alluded to as well. And even beyond that, it's almost primarily residential. So LD 26 in Northeast Lincoln, we have some commercial areas, but it's mostly neighborhoods. And so when I talk to my constituents and they want to do these things, I think that, again, being a part of that solution is being able to allow homeowners to do what they will with their own property. So it's part of a larger conversation about what we can and can't do with our property, but I think I'll leave it at that for right now. I'm very happy to be here, happy to continue answering questions, but I've learned a lot so far diving into this, and I'm excited to learn more.
Very good. Thank you. Senator Cavanaugh.
Well, thanks for having me, John. Again, I think this is my third time being here, and I guess I'm the in-between guy. I've been in the legislature for 2.5, 3 years. And I sit on the Natural Resources Committee, and I had the decency to stay there. And I have a little bit more insight into why Tom keeps inviting me down to check out his combine. So,
Don't go alone.
or maybe I better go alone.
Yeah, don't bring a second attorney.
Yeah, don't bring a second attorney.
I shouldn't go with you.
But in terms of how Tom is constantly mean to me, he's this weekend he sicked my daughter on me about my particular hue of red shirt I wore to the Nebraska game, and she has not stopped talking about it.
It was orange.
Agree to disagree, Tom, but the point is my daughter won't leave me alone, so you have successfully done that. So I sit on the Natural Resource Committee. I can start with, I guess, challenges. In the Nebraska current configuration of the Nebraska legislature, I feel like every conversation we have centered around renewables is, in some way trying to create artificial barriers to entry. We had a few bills this last session that were clever and maybe not so clever attempts to make it harder and harder for folks to build wind in this state, for people to license and get new projects stood up. So that's a lot of what's going on, in my opinion, in the Natural Resources Committee. We could sit here and talk about it a lot. I'm sure you guys have talked about it. Al probably has a better recollection of exactly what that is, so maybe he could force him to talk about it. But I was just sort of flipping through. I remembered we were sitting here as Senator Dungan was talking, and I saw you have on here coming up tomorrow morning, Inflation Reduction Act, the greatest investment in rural electrification since Rural Electrification Act. And I saw Chris McLean was in the back, but he maybe stepped out a minute ago. So I would certainly encourage you to go to that. But in terms of what I'm, I guess, bringing that up is, what is our great opportunity? There's this huge federal investment in these projects. And at the state level, we need to make sure that we are a good partner in attempting to capture those funds in whatever way we can in the legislature. And so we need to be looking at those sorts of conversations going forward and bringing bills that will allow us to leverage those funds and then build into the future with that. So I think that's a big opportunity we have, and we've not been great at it because of our predisposition to being opposed politically to these things. I don't know what else you want me to talk about. I'm being a lot more brief than these guys. But the other thing I should have said when I started, I'm from District 9, which is an urban district, and we call it the Sunshine District. And it's not because of our amount of rooftop solar installations, unfortunately, but maybe someday we could be named as such. So I can pass it off to Al, and then we can move on to the next part.
Al Davis, former state senator from Legislative District 43.
Well, thank you all for coming to this conference. I think it's an important event that has really demonstrated the interest that Nebraska has in renewables. I'm just going to, first of all, extend my deepest sympathy to these three folks here to my left who had an awful year behind them in the legislature. I don't know how many of you watch it. I'm a lobbyist, so I need to watch it, and it was painful, to be honest with you. It was just a painful year in many respects. And it's unfortunate that so many culture war issues have entered into everything that we do. Renewables is just a perfect example of that. You know, there are so many valid, legitimate, really realistic reasons that this state should actively pursue the renewable industry. But because of the culture wars, you know, we're getting a lot of pushback in a lot of parts of the state, and parts of the state that could really use that development. And I'm very sorry about that, and I think that's our biggest problem. I will tell you, when I was in the body, one of the bills that I introduced was a bill to fund this transmission study, basically, of the state of Nebraska called the Brattle Report, which was done in 2014 or 15. One thing that report identified was that we really couldn't do a lot of development without more transmission. So, you know, one of the examples of that, of course, is the R line that was in the process of being constructed. I think it was proposed in, maybe John, you would know, 2010, 2008, somewhere back in there. Almost 20 years later, we still haven't built that because of opposition, some of which is valid, but a lot of which is just not in my backyard. So Nebraskans need to accept the fact that there are new technologies and new ways to move forward. You made reference to the Inflation Reduction Act, and I firmly believe that will help us get over the hump. Our state needs jobs in rural parts of the state. Rural economic development is always talked about. We need buy-in by the communities, and we need buy-in by the people that live there. So that, to me, is the barrier that we face in our future. We've had in the past, I will say, as part of the renewable, I guess we'll call it the industry. I'm not paid, but I've always been interested in it. But, you know, we've had really a lot of opposition in the legislature by the REAs. I'm hopeful that may be changing. I think that would be a game changer for all of us, because the old model ultimately that has worked for years and years and years in the industry is going to fade away when storage becomes available for farmers and ranchers to go off on their own. So, you know, there really needs to be a partnership between the industry and the REAs to find a way forward into the future. So that's my hope for the next couple of years. I'd like to see some good legislation come out of the Natural Resources Committee, and I'll look to Senator Brandt and Senator Cavanaugh for some of that next time around. Thank you.
So we had the 90-day session that went on forever this last time. So you mentioned it. Those of us who've been involved in the legislative process for a long time, and my tour of duties well over 45 years, I've never seen our citizens' legislature in such a uncivil point of departure in terms of there were a lot of things that got said and a lot of things that got done, neither of which should have ever happened. And so, you know, as you look at that lack of civility, and you look at the challenges that we have, looking into the 60-day session, which is the fine-tuner of the budget and the dealing with the carryover legislation, I'd ask you to dive into the always interesting and dangerous and area of trying to predict a bit about what you think it is that might go on this next session. Or maybe you have big announcements to make about legislation that you're carrying that now would be a great time to mention. Tom.
We introduced over 800 bills last year. We passed 31. Inside of those 31 were 297 total bills. We found a way. It wasn't pretty. We didn't debate. So you had for example, a revenue bill, I believe had 27 or 28 bills in it. And because of what was happening in the legislature on the floor, and 2 of those bills were mine, and I stood up for 1 minute each on them, introduced them, and sat down. And so basically the introducers spent about the first 45 minutes saying what was in the bill, and the next 7 hours was spent by the people that were filibustering. It wasn't debated. And I'm not going to pick on that particular bill, but there's a lot of these Christmas trees where a lot of stuff just passed because you had enough senators had enough bills in it that nobody opposed somebody else's bill. And that's not a good way to do business. I mean, there's some things in some of these bills that really, in my opinion, needed more work. And so I'm hopeful, and I think the speaker in talking to him, that it will be a different session in the 60-day session. We don't know what's going to happen. There's going to be probably some more cultural bills come up, maybe. And if they come up early, it could look a lot like last year, or it could look totally different. We don't even need to introduce any bills this session because we've got so many left over from last year. We only heard about half of the priority bills. I know my priority bill is still sitting there, which was dark fiber, but, and I don't know if you guys, did you get your priority bills heard? Yeah, Cavanaugh's going, no.
It got wrapped into it.
Yeah, so he got Christmas treed, so his is one of these that we probably should have debated some more, but hey, that's how it goes. But yeah, I'm not aware of anything major outside of what everybody already knows, so I'm going to pass the mic.
Yeah, I don't have any major announcements to make here today. And I think that, the question that John sort of posits for us about what's going to happen next session is one that I've been asked countless times, I think, since the session ended. And my answer is very similar to Senator Brandt's, which is that I don't think anybody knows what to fully expect. I can say what I hope for. And what I hope for is a session that operates and moves in a much more, I guess, typical fashion, one that we've seen before. I joke occasionally, and there's truth in it, when people ask whether or not I like being in the legislature, and I say, I don't know, I'll let you know when I see it, because I've only been in one session. So my bar is very low, which is, I think, in some ways nice. Can only go up from here, I hope. But, the reality of the situation is the legislature, I often pontificate probably too much about how much I like the unique nature of our unicameral. And it's one of the things that makes Nebraska really special. And I think there's a lot of people in this room who have dedicated a lot of time, folks in this panel, and helping us here also, to the legislature and the unicameral. And the system that we have in place works, right? We know for a fact that for decades, what we've done here in Nebraska has, I think, insulated us from a lot of the culture war issues that we've seen elsewhere. And I think part of that is because the unique nature of the unicameral has sort of, by virtue of how it's set up, forced cooperation and I think an avoidance of a lot of those things that have previously brought other legislatures and senates in other states to a halt. So I hope that we don't see as much of that this next session. And I'm not trying to dive into politics with regard to these issues, because I know they're not important, I think, to what we're talking about here today. But what is important, I think, is consistent fidelity to the system that has got us to where we are right now, right? There's, I think, a lot of times a desire we've heard from people to change things. But what we know is that we are where we are today because the unicameral has operated in a way that I think has protected us from some of those issues. So, I don't have any major bills that I want to announce here today that I think are of particular importance to this group, but I do hope that the people in this room who are involved in politics and involved in talking to your state legislators or your industry groups will do your best to hopefully encourage some of that fidelity to the system, because I think it does keep us afloat in a way that we haven't seen in other states.
Senator Cavanaugh.
Thanks, John. The predicting is always dangerous. In terms of announcements, I don't have any specific announcements. There's a lot of ideas I'm working on. And actually, just say, is David Holtzclaw here? No? I just heard him on the radio yesterday and was talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and specifically some of the things he was discussing that at the state level that we should be working on. So anybody who wants to talk about that, I'd be interested in exploring ideas of, like I said, that what we can be doing at the state level to help us capture more of those funds. And I see Chris is back there now. I gave you a shout out earlier, Chris, about how everybody needs to go to your panel tomorrow about the Inflation Reduction Act. So if I can find a way for some action that we can take at the state level and bring a bill next year that would help us capture and leverage some more of those funds, I'd certainly be interested in doing that. We have attempted to do that. We did the hydrogen hub stuff that we attempted to do to bring a hydrogen hub to Senator Brandt's district. And ultimately we weren't one of the winning bids on that, but I think there was good value in us attempting to do that and working toward that. But other ways that we can capture and leverage those federal funds are the types of things I'd be interested in working on in the next session. It's a 60-day session, like everybody said. Not a lot happened in the last session. If past is prologue, not a lot's going to happen in this session. But I'm hopeful that I'm a strong believer in the fact that when you have something that goes horribly wrong, you make some mistakes in life, that's a great opportunity for learning and a great opportunity to take the lessons from that and do better next time. So I'm like Senator Dungan. I have respect for the body itself and how it's meant to function, and I have faith that it will be able to right that ship and actually have a functioning legislature in the next 60 days. But I guess worst case scenario, we get a new legislature in a year and a half from now, and then we can try and start all over again.
Well, of course, I'm not there, so I can't talk about bills that I think I'm going to introduce, but I want to second what Senator Brandt said about the Christmas tree process and why that's not very good public policy. And I'll take the natural resources bill because I know that one best. As a lobbyist for the Sierra Club, I sat in on the Natural Resources Committee quite often. So it contained the hydrogen hub piece, which I think we all think was a good idea. There was also a funding piece in there for a hydrogen hub that came out of, I think, another committee, or did that one come out of your committee, John? The community college piece for that came out.
Had to go through appropriations as well.
Through appropriations too. And then there were a couple bills that dealt with membership on the board of NPPD, which the Sierra Club was opposed to. Then there were a couple bills that dealt with game parks. One raised the fees and for hunting, and one was called the varmint bill, or the pheasant reduction, or the pheasant salvation bill, which basically gave people the right to kill varmints, with the idea that the varmints are eating the eggs of the pheasants. Well, from my perspective, you do away with one varmint, you end up with more, and so we were opposed to that. But that bill came to the floor. So as the united bill, even though there was some opposition within the committee, it ultimately was the five people in the committee that moved that bill forward. So that really gives that committee complete authority over what progresses out of the committee itself. I just don't think that's good policy as much as possible. The saving grace of the Nebraska legislature is the fact that it's a very democratic process. There's not a lot of power invested in one or more individuals. We need to keep that. That's a very important part of what we do here in Nebraska. It's why it has worked so well for almost a century, and why I am fearful that we're marching down this line of more and more partisanship as sort of institutional memory fades away, and that's happening now. So you've seen a more partisan body get elected every 2 years for the last decade. That's not good for the state. Thanks.
And when is Chris McLean going to speak to us tomorrow? Now that you build up his it's just been the tension, the excitement's been building, Chris. 8:15 in the morning. 8:15 in the morning, and we're really pleased that he's going to be here with us, a friend for a long time. And I think his nickname these days is Moneybags McLean from USDA. And so we're looking forward to that. So some of the things that we've thrown out in this conference is that we've said before, we always share the latest and best information with a wide range of stakeholders, and education. There's nothing of consequence or substance that's going to get done. Problems going to be addressed without a lot of education. And so this conference is all about that education, but it's also been about the business of identifying barriers to development. And that's kind of the forward lean of the conference historically. And so you identify barriers, you work together with the community that this helps develop, and then you help remove those barriers. And so I guess my last question, so we've got about 15 minutes to clean up, so you can kind of use the last question as your close as well. But here we are. It's taken us all these years to get to the point where we have 3,519.9 megawatts of wind energy developed in the state of Nebraska, along with 58.84 megawatts of solar. And when I do my back of the envelope math and say, what's up? What's the prospects for the future look like? And knowing that we have unprecedented federal incentives in place that we've never had before. I look at the green hydrogen plant in Gothenburg with green fertilizer. I look at the green fertilizer plant in Hallam. I look at the Google facility that would not have come to Lincoln were it not for the commitment to renewable energy, green renewable energy. I see the new stuff, the expansion in the OPPD footprint, and I get well over 3,500 megawatts of new demand staring us right in the face amidst all of these additional federal incentives. And so while we're still struggling with our friends at the local community who have historically had their hands up yelling, come here, come to my county. We need economic development. We need new jobs. We need new farm income. We need new tax base, all of those things. We're now seeing counties and at the local level really taking a different tack. So what is it that we can do as a state, given the kind of the historic economic development opportunities that we have in front of us? What are the steps that you think that we need to make in order to be able to capture that upside potential, which can transform our state?
Let's start with Google. I had the opportunity to sit next to the manager and a out-of-state vice president a year ago at one of the functions I was at. And I said, this is what happens in Nebraska. We spend a boatload of Nebraska Advantage Act money to build these huge mega centers in Papillion, La Vista, Omaha, or Lincoln. And they're only going to come here if they get renewable energy. Well, guess what? All the renewable energy ends up in my district, or they try and force it down our throats, and yet all the jobs are up in Omaha and Lincoln. And I said, really, to make this fair, at least open a satellite office down in Fairbury or Hebron or something like that. So if they're going to build wind towers or solar, that at least my district gets some share of that. So that's something that we need to look at. We're very fortunate. Senator Cavanaugh, I'm going to shift gears here, is probably the lead legislator on eminent domain. And in natural resources, we do a lot on eminent domain, and it breaks down into two different categories. Traditional eminent domain for the public good, roads and power lines. And you can relate to that, and that tends to be under attack constantly. And then the second one is CO2, where you have private companies come in and try and build a function that, to me, is not necessarily a traditional view of the public good. And that kind of poisons the well. And I think you're going to see, I'm sure Senator Cavanaugh is going to address this when it's his turn, but we're going to see more work on that. And I guess what I would like to see is if we're going to change eminent domain in Nebraska, it's going to be on those private companies, because they're trying to eminent domain or use the threat of eminent domain to get their pipelines through, and they are not sharing their wealth with the people that they're taking the land from. It's a totally different situation than if you're trying to widen the road for all the public. So, I mean, that's one of the views I've got. And then the last real quick point I would like to make, I'm shifting gears again. I was in CSG conference in Detroit this summer, and we had a speaker from Michigan State Extension, and he is their energy expert. And in rural Michigan, they equate it to how many miles per acre. So if you got 200 bushel corn, you can get X gallons of ethanol, and that's about 5,000 miles per acre. If you have solar panels and you put that into electric cars, it's 500,000 miles. And these are approximate numbers, and you can look this up. And it was a very interesting presentation when you break it down like that on what the potential is. And then they brought up on the solar some of the bifacial stuff. Part of the problem with solar is right now we have a shed effect. When you put solar panels out there, you're going to have a huge runoff of water, and that's going to change the water courses in our rural communities. But if you go vertical, which isn't as efficient, but what he was saying is now you can build your feedlots out of solar panels. Think about that. You can run them around the edge of your field and not lose any production because it's where the fence is at. If we can get to these kind of technologies, and technology's changing every day, those are going to be game changers.
I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head there, John, and this is also going back to what Tom said earlier too. I mean, education is key, and that sounds really basic, but I think that when you're having conversations regarding renewables, no matter what it is, but in particular wind and solar, when you start the conversation, there's usually a lot of misnomers. There's a lot of concerns people have. There's a lot of questions they have. And oftentimes I've found, at least anecdotally, that a lot of opposition comes from inaccurate information, or at least unanswered questions. I choose to believe it doesn't come from malice. It often comes from ignorance, right? And I think that a lot of times education is key to getting through to people about those things. And when you're able to remove those barriers, then you can have an honest conversation about what the real problems are. I was at a separate panel this morning, and it's something completely different. But one of the things that was talked about is that those who are closest to the problem have to be involved in the solution, was something that got talked about a lot in this conversation. And so going back to what Tom had said earlier, when you're in communities where you're talking about implementing additional wind or solar services, and you have that opposition, if you continue to do this and run up against each other, it's very difficult to actually get to the solution, because the people who are having the biggest problem with it often have to be included in coming up with what the solution is. That doesn't necessarily mean that either side is 100% going to acquiesce or give in, but I think that cooperation is important. And taking that a step further, and again, I'm jumping off a lot of what you said here, so thank you. I appreciate not having to go first. It makes my life a lot easier. I think that when you start to have these conversations in rural communities or other communities outside of Omaha or Lincoln, you have to include all different levels of folks, right? So we're talking about the county boards, which obviously are incredibly important with regard to having these conversations, but you also have to make sure you get out there and educate the people in the community, and that you provide an opportunity for actual conversation. You have to provide an opportunity for people to be heard, but then have a back and forth and a dialogue, if they're willing to have it, regarding their concerns. I think that does happen in a lot of circumstances, and I know there's a lot of people in this room who work really, really hard to get that information to other people. But I do think that education and frank communication is at least one of the building blocks in actually achieving these solutions. The last thing I'll say on that too is that I think educating people about the actual processes and procedures is one facet. The other facet is that money talks, and convincing individuals about the actual data that implementing this renewable energy in whatever fashion we're talking about brings business to Nebraska, right? It does provide jobs. It provides those green jobs, but it also, there's a lot of corporations and entities out there that anymore don't want to do business in a state that doesn't derive at least a portion of the energy they're going to be getting from those green energy sources. And so the education, I think, has to be about the actual form of energy itself, but then also about the actual monetary value that you're going to see as an influx from that. And so I've worked with a number of people in this room to sort of try to drill down some of those numbers in the interim session and try to figure out what actual kind of economic impact we're talking about by further investment in renewable energy. And so hopefully we can have some of that information for some of our colleagues in the next legislature, because I think that's going to be really important information.
All right, it's on to me. So I guess I'll take the bait from Brandt and talk about eminent domain. And to circle back, education is really important, and I appreciate there's a lot of folks in here. I'm looking around and seeing folks who taking the time to educate me about these issues. And they're really complicated. And, to Brandt's point about Google having a satellite office or eminent domain, it's a question of fairness. And it's a question of making sure that everybody shares in the benefit and making sure that everybody gets treated respectfully and fairly and gets a shot at making money, having their dreams come true. And we all, I think almost everybody here is at least interested in renewable, in wind and solar because they think you can make money off of it. We all, I assume, also are interested in decarbonizing our electrical generation. And so there's both of those things. But really, if we are going to get to a point where we are shifting and employing more wind and solar, it has to make economic sense. It has to make sense for the people who are building it, for the investors. It has to make sense for the public utilities who have an obligation to their ratepayers. But it has to make sense for the folks whose land you're going to put it on in those counties. And it does include having those outreaches and those conversations and connections with those folks. It has to do with paying a fair wage to the people who are going to build and maintain those facilities, making sure that everybody has a share of that. And so, eminent domain, I think, is a question we're going to talk about going forward. It is one of the bills. Full disclosure, I suppose my jumping off point on eminent domain, how I got into it was probably because of one of the bills I didn't like in natural resources this year. And it kind of that's how these things happen. You have a one-off conversation and you end up spending the remainder 6 months of your life on it. But I've learned a lot. And one thing I have learned about it is how complicated an issue it is. And how if you pull one thread, it might have an effect somewhere else. And that is a big part of just regulation in general from us as policymakers, where trying to create a fair regulatory structure that protects the people, the citizens of Nebraska, the members of those communities, but also doesn't become unduly burdensome and specifically geared towards one industry that I might not like for my own philosophical reasons or somebody else in the legislature doesn't like. And far too often in the legislature right now, we're seeing that is the form that these bills take. It is directly pointed at trying to find a way to undermine an industry you don't like, as opposed to trying to find a fair regulatory structure that works for everybody. And so that's the approach I've been trying to take and being educated by a lot of folks about ways that we can make changes, specifically to eminent domain in that respect. But that's the approach I think we should take to all of these things, where when we create an incentive for renewables, we need to be conscious of how that's going to play out and make sure that the benefit is shared by everybody and it's not just, I guess, a boondoggle or something like that. It's going to line the pockets of some private entity. I know a lot of you probably represent some of those private entities, but that's what I'm looking forward to trying to do. And I think we've got some real opportunities there. But of course, all opportunities come with challenges and risks, but I think we got a bright future. So, thanks.
Well, I think one of the things that's so different today from when I was in the legislature, which is getting close to 10 years now, 9 years, or 8 years, is that at that time, public utilities had enough energy. They didn't need any extra energy. You heard this morning how the explosive demand and power is out there. And that just is a huge opportunity for people that are into the renewable industry and want to engage in that, to work with public power in a way that wasn't really possible some years ago. So that is going to drive a lot of this change. Somehow, though, we have to bridge this issue with the culture wars, and I'm not quite sure how we do that. And when I say the culture wars, what I'm talking about is when people have these draconian ideas about setbacks, which in some respects are almost the main kind of issue. On the other hand, where you're trying to restrict a property owner's rights to use his land because you don't like what he's doing to that, or because you're jealous of him because he's got the contract and you don't. That happens in parts of rural Nebraska. So, there needs to be a conversation that takes place between developers and the people that are opposed, and see if there's any way to find a common ground. I think a lot of the developers don't really understand. So I talk a lot about rural Nebraska because that's what I'm familiar with. But I think a lot of developers just don't understand the mindset of a lot of rural people who have been living in communities that have been declining for 100 years. And, you've kind of gotten used to that. But it's hard then to grasp onto something that's going to change your community. So sometimes people are more inclined to say, well, I just want it to stay the way it is now. That's never going to happen. But you've got to change that mindset. You've got to bring people forward. If you look at the communities in Nebraska that work well, Gothenburg's a good example, Broken Bow, Valentine, they're full of young, energetic leaders who are interested in trying to find new solutions for their community. We have some huge opportunities ahead of us, and we need to all work together to make that happen in our state. And, we've got incredible resources, great wind, good solar potential. They used to call us the Saudi Arabia wind or something like that. So let's take advantage of that and let's figure out how to do that.
So we have a handout in the Nebraska Farmers Union booth. It's called Growing the Rural Economy with Ethanol, and the backside is Growing the Rural Economy with Wind. And so as you look at the opportunities in agriculture with value added in growing our economy and doing all those things, our ethanol industry has added over $5 billion worth of new capital investment and new tax base, not to mention all of the jobs and other things it's done. So it's been wildly successful. It was more successful than any of the rural economic development programs our state ever developed or deployed. Now here we look at wind, and here we are, just the new kid on the block, really just getting a good start. And we've already got $17.6 million of new annual income for Nebraska farmers and landowners, $17.6 million of new local tax revenues that will go on annually for at least 20 years, at least 2,200 estimated new direct jobs that are good paying jobs with benefits in rural communities. And those jobs, how many jobs in your rural community, if you're familiar with one, how many jobs do you have in your community that pay over $50,000 a year with benefits? A lot of times you don't have to take off your other glove to be able to count the number of jobs in your town that are over $50,000. So it's a big deal. Not to mention the 7,640 construction jobs and the $6.159 billion worth of new tax base. So here we have what is arguably examples of really effective rural economic development. And it's all done by willing folks if they're given the opportunity to do what it is that their will is to do. And so I was struck, Senator Dungan, about the private property rights conflict that you shared with Senator Brandt over private property rights. And we continue to say that my neighbor's right not to have a wind turbine or a solar project on their property is the exact same right that I have to have one if I want one. So we have a lot of opportunities here, and you have big jobs ahead of you. And as always, good public policy is not only education, but it's also partnership. And it's all of us doing our job to work with you and to help you and to talk to you and to share. And thank you for the incredibly tough jobs that you have in order to be able to help represent the state's strategic, economic, and quality of life interests. Thank you for taking time to be with us today. And thanks for doing what you do. Let's give them a big hand.